Greetings, friends and fans, O1s to O10s. I am Karagoth, and this is my first upload since the leaderboard reset. Countless nerfing by Eugen Systems has rendered the Israeli deck one of the weakest decks in this game. We're going to go into the concept behind the Israeli deck first, and then we're going to talk about all the implications in that regard. Alright, Israeli deck concept. Let's get through it. Israeli deck concept. As compared to most other decks in the game, which base their entire platform on simplicity, the concept behind the Israeli deck was initially, I think, was to have a platform of individual units that by themselves cannot achieve a number of tasks, but combined and put together can put up a front stronger compared to other decks in the game. What this means is that while other nations' decks have a lower points for building a deck relative to what Israel is getting, and I'm talking about armory points. That Israel has got 60 armory points and other decks have 45, sometimes 50, 55. Other decks can rely on a single unit to achieve a task, that if you're using the Israeli deck to achieve that very same task, you would need 2, maybe 3 units to achieve the same goal. So as I said, other nations are simplistic in their nature. For example, if you want to call upon let's say a recon tank. Other nations, bluefur and redfur, have the ability to call upon a recon tank. So while playing bluefur or redfur, you can call upon a recon tank with a very good visibility that can carry a punch, and it's got max range, very good mobility, but by playing Israel, you would need to buy a recon unit and put it in close proximity to that tank. So you need to buy 2 units. You need to buy a recon unit that will cost you, I don't know, 20 at the minimum. It depends on what kind of carrier you're using. It can amount up to 50 points. But if you want to play cheap, you can buy, Bedouins for 20 points with a Bardelas or something like this, and put a tank next to it, say a Magach. All right, so it's 70 points. So you're getting for 90 points what the other nations are getting for 65 points. Alright? So while Israel is a micromanagement nightmare, the concept behind it, when you use the Israeli deck, if you can manage it, the combined use of units, put together, and the higher cost of getting them to the battlefield might outweigh the cost your enemy is getting by using his simplistic units, because he's spending 65 points, you're spending 90 points to get the same result. But that in itself should eventually grant you some sort of an advantage over your enemy. So on paper, in theory, your 90 points should overcome the 65 points the enemy has put forward in battle. That's on theory, on paper. In actual fact and in practice, it doesn't work that way. For over 5 years playing Wargame Red Dragon, one can only reach one conclusion. Eugen failed miserably in many respects in that regard. Not only that the use of units cost more in terms of cost effectiveness while playing Israel, but it is also evident that your combined arms are weaker even when put together to confront the enemy much cheaper simplistic units. So unless you're facing a much weaker opponent in the game, would make a lot of mistakes, it is very unlikely you'll be able to turn the tide of battle at any point of the game, let alone the last minutes of the game. Eugen has just heed the calls and screams of all the other people who do not understand the concept behind this deck, and assume that having 60 armory points means that they assume that Israel having 60 armory points to build a deck means that Israel deck will have some sort of unfair advantage over others. And as a result of that, the Israeli nation deck was subject to nerfing, because Eugen systems listened to all the people screaming Israel is too strong, Israel is too strong, rendering it, powerless to combat other decks in the game. And the nerfing has rendered it, it's almost useless now. Almost unplayable in 1v1. It is great, it's a great deck to have if you are playing 10v10, because the artillery pieces Israel has are just amazing in 10v10, because they have a wide spread and they can cover a lot of ground, but in 1v1 you just won't get to use them in a manner that would benefit your army. They're small maps, it's one opponent, there are not too many units around. You just won't get the RT units to turn the tide of battle. Unless you're extremely lucky and your opponent is extremely stupid and puts everything in one single position and lets you recon it and just wait the time for your artillery pieces to reload and fire, which should take, I don't know, a minute or so. Talking about the MLRS type of artillery units. Alright, let's go on, let's move on. Okay, nerfing of the Israeli deck by Eugen systems has rendered it one of the weakest decks in this game. In simple terms, the condition of the Israeli deck confronting its opponents in 1v1 is simply quite appalling. In regards to cost effectiveness, in points, tanks, visibility, movement, speed, mobility, overall ability, the Israeli deck quite simply does not have the ability to confront other decks on an equal level, toe-to-toe on a set piece. This battle you see here, if you are following the battle that I'm showing you here, can serve you as a prime example to that effect. The enemy I'm facing here clearly does not know what he's doing, nor does he understand basic principles of how to play this game effectively. Essentially, you do not get to see him make any use of coordinated arty strikes, air cover for his advancing units, no bombing runs coordinated with push moves, no use of cover for his advancing units, rendering them completely exposed, no use of medium tanks in large quantities, which playing Red 4 decks, you should know that this is undoubtedly one of the biggest strong suits of Red 4 decks. The powerful medium and heavy tanks the Red 4 decks can field. Just check the China deck, alright? You got 50 points worth of tank that can fire a punch of 19 AP power. You got a 65 point tank that can serve as a super heavy unit, super heavy tank. It has a 21 AP power, which is incredible to have for a tank, 21 AP power. And while he is using a few medium tanks, you get to see him not giving a second thought to their survivability, clearly rushing them to open fields. Amongst other foregone considerations, you can see that this player does not defend his rear areas. This player is not making any scouting missions using his recon tab, just buying up units and using the fast move order to rush positions. Sometimes not even unloading his vehicles. Flying helicopters over almost certainly occupied areas, or suspected to be occupied areas, resulting in the destruction of the helicopters and its payload, which is most certainly much valued infantry units. And yet, he manages to make incredible gains, considering his level of incompetence and You know, he manages to advance very far and very deep into my controlled areas, bullying me until the very last minutes of this battle. You will see. It is important to note that if you were playing the Israeli deck and you would have exhibited the same amount, same such a poor judgment, failure in command controlling your forces, this game would have been over in like 5-10 minutes. And I'm stretching it because it most likely would have been over in 5. Anyway, this guy must have been snorting crack, because at the end of this match, after having exhibited ridiculously poor skill, he came on chat and said that he expected to win the way the battle was going. But he didn't win because Israel is an OP nation, pay to win. This is ridiculous. It's very simple, just to throw it out there to say Israel is a very powerful nation. That is the reason I lost. Not because I'm stupid, not because I'm worthless, not because I'm incompetent. It's all because the enemy is using a better deck. Well, there are decks 10 times stronger, and you can see that they have abilities that the Israeli deck does not even possess. And I wasn't even using Maglan. I was using only one unit of Maglan the entire battle, and it died. So people always, when they talk about Israel, they complain about the Maglan being so powerful, which is not true, because a 5-man team can be shot twice by a tank, and that's it. So long to your Maglans. You cannot rush a position just by using those Maglans, because if you try, you most definitely use those Maglans. And I've seen most of the experienced players just rush Maglans when they see him, because they know by the time the Maglan will try to open up the second salvo, the tank would most probably destroy and kill the Maglans before they had a chance to fire up the second rocket. So unlike other nations' deck that you get to see like incredible superpower units, like the KA-52 and the Patriot, or the Adats, or the automatic, that before you can open your mouth and say, how did I lose these units, they have already taken out like 3 planes out of the sky. So really, right? I'm just saying that this is exactly the type of people that were screaming to Eugen to nerf the Israeli deck. Not because Israel needed to be nerfed back then, alright? If anything, it needed to be buffed. But they asked Israel to be nerfed because, they like the skill and brain power to play this game effectively. But hey, this deck is called Israel, and we can't be having Jews winning games around here now, can we? I mean, seriously, you let the Jews win? No way. You gotta be anti-Semitic about this. They did not complain about, as I said, they did not complain about any other of the other decks being 10 times stronger than Israel. No, they complain about this one, specifically, the Israeli deck. Sad thing is, they succeeded. Eugen nerfed Israel to the point of extinction. That right now, as you can see, it is nearly impossible to win a 1v1 battle, unless your enemy does not have a clue what he is doing, meaning that only if your enemy is that bad of a player, only then you will get you get some sort of a chance some sort of a fair chance to win the battle. Anyways, we're going to go over once this battle is complete, we're going to go over the Israeli deck piece by piece and dissect it. I want to talk about the Israeli deck. I want to talk about the nerfing problem that has rendered it almost useless, the major gaps between its units and other nations' units, deck tabs, super units it does not possess but should, Basically, we are going to talk about suggestions of improvements to make this deck more balanced than how it is now. Alright, we talked about the Israeli concept and the fact that Israel has 60 points to build a deck while other nations have less than 60 points to build a deck. And the reason for that derives from the fact that while other nations' more simplistic units can do a multitude of tasks, Israel needs the multitude of units to do the very same task. So I want to talk to you now about the greatest Israeli deficiency, which is, in its deck, which is the Israeli medium tanks, which are practically non-existent. Israel has staple gun on its tanks. They're quite simply tanks that can do no damage. The tank lines AP power range from 9, AP power 11, 13, 17, 15, which are the lowest AP power in the game, whilst the super heavy tanks Israel can field hold a rather high AP power of 20 and 23 AP power. Those would be the Merkava 3B, I think, 155 points, and the Merkava Baz, which costs 180 points. And now, let's talk about the medium tanks. The low caliber 105mm smoothbore cannon gun is just in no way a match for the heavier guns that other nations are using, which primarily consist of 120mm main caliber smoothbore cannon guns. The 120mm guns have a very much higher AP power, which render the Israeli high armor on its tanks, well, seem completely useless. What you get is that on paper, the Israeli med tanks seem superb, but in practice they are paper tanks, nothing more, and can be easily overcome and overpowered by their adversaries in any engagement. Even if you get a Red 4 tank that costs 50 or 35 points, it can beat 95 points Israel is using to fight against it. So in terms of cost effectiveness and in ability in the field, it's just no match whatsoever. I mean, Israel tanks, even in better positions and in cover, awaiting advancing enemy tanks, say doing an ambush for the enemy tanks, will open fire on the enemy medium tanks armor, and the return fire from those advancing enemy tanks will destroy the awaiting Israeli tanks. So even if your tanks have the pickle on the enemy first, it won't make much of a difference, which is a huge disadvantage to be having in a game that is supposed to have some sort of balance to it. Basically, what this means is that even tanks that are in better position, that cost more, get their asses handed to them by less invested in points tanks the enemy is using. You simply cannot have a nation that cannot deal with medium tanks with medium tanks, unless it calls upon super heavy tanks to deal with each and every single enemy medium tank. It would take you, 360 points, sometimes 440 points of medium tanks of your own to counter kill an enemy 85 to 125 point tank the enemy is using. And while the enemy medium tanks can battle it out with your super heavy tanks, and sometimes even win, and I've seen a Wilk take out a Baz, trust me, I've seen it multiple times. Your medium tanks are just no match for the enemy medium tanks, because the result in any such encounter is, in most cases, a certain annihilation of your medium tanks, unless you tuck tail and run. Facing the front armor to your enemy. Like, that would do much of a difference. Not more so when they come face to face with an enemy super heavy tank. Now, to see a super heavy tank on a battlefield used by your enemy is a disaster. You just won't be able to take it out unless you use an aircraft. There's just no way it can take like 4 or 5 missiles from a very powerful ATGM unit, and still it will keep coming. And most certainly by the time the ATGM unit try to fire the second time, you got dreadful tanks with 4 HE power that they just devastate infantry, they melt them. So okay, let's move on to other things that Israel deck has a problem with. Alright, we talked about the Israeli concept, we talked a little about the Israeli tanks deficiency, let's talk about troop carriers and infantry. I want to talk about another great deficiency Israel has. It has so many of them that it is practically unplayable in 1 versus 1. One other great deficiency it has is the ability to reach the front lines with its troops fast, and to be able to support the troops once they get there. So, well, while other nations have wheeled infantry carriers that have autocannons that can melt infantry and fire and destroy both armor units and infantry units alike, Israel simply does not have autocannons on its deck at all. I mean, nothing whatsoever. Mobility, which is a very important factor that Israel lacks. While other nations have a lot of troops carriers with max range on the map of 1,000 kilometers, max speed of 150 and off-road speed of 105, and while they get there to when they get to their destinations, they can defend themselves with good guns and pretty decent armor to them. Israel troops carriers can only have, I think, something like 500 kilometers of range, and the road speed is mostly 110. Off-road speed is 40 to 65, something like this, I think. So, I mean, enemy units, enemy nations. I mean, when you play other nations which turn out to be your enemy in the game, they can move twice as fast and reach the front and can do something in the front, while your units, they get there late, and when they get there they can do nothing. I mean, this is a great deficiency to have. And if you want to use something that can reach the front fast, you will have to be using something like the Hummer or the Ram Recce. So the problem is that while the troops carriers that can almost reach the range of the the range and speed we were talking about that other nations were using. I mean, let's say the Ram Recce and the Hammer can reach top speed of road speed of 150. Once they get to the front lines, they are useless because they have one machine gun and they have no armor at all. So I mean, even if you use the stronger, slower infantry carriers Israel has on its deck, you will still reach the front line late, and those units will still be meaningless. Same as the Hammer and the Recce. And why? Because they face the enemy autocannon guns, fast movers. Machine guns against armor-piercing auto gun is no contest. It's not a contest. You might as well be throwing rocks at the enemy infantry carriers. I mean, really. You get to the front, and you get there. You find the enemy is already there, and then when you open fire on them, nothing happens. And when they fire on you, your units die. This is a huge disadvantage to have playing, the Israeli deck. As I said, the game is just not balanced. It's simply you simply do not have the tools needed to have a fair fight against any of the other decks. You use troop carriers that use half the speed the enemy is using, and once they get to the front lines, they get annihilated. Because the enemy is using cannons and guns, and your troop carriers are very slow, and once they get there, if there's not an ambush waiting for them, once they get there, they cannot support the troops, because a gun can take out any of your troop carriers, and your troop carriers cannot do any damage to the enemy whatsoever. The only way you can somehow win is if your units get past the enemy infantry and try to kill the, from close range I mean, to kill the enemy troop carriers. But that would just not happen because the enemies, I mean, only if the enemy is that stupid to put forth his troop carriers in plain view, and even then it would be hard because the infantry rushing auto guns that can melt them. This is just no contest. It's just no contest at all. It's insane. It's insurmountable odds. You just have nothing to get to the front fast and that could support your troops. Nothing of value. I mean, you can take the recon deck and you can use those 20 points little thingies, the ram recce with the gun on them, but they have no armor. And the enemy does have armor. And they only fire 7 rounds per minute, and your enemy is firing like 360 rounds per minute. You see the point I'm trying to convey here? There is no contest. There's just no contest. The enemy will reach there first, and he will be stronger when he gets there. So there's just another major deficiency Israel has, and it's not the only one, and I wish it was just the second or third one, but there's more. Let's go over to the anti-air defense, which is it's practically non-existent compared to other nations' decks. All right, but before we go into other deficiencies the Israeli deck has, like its mediocre air defense systems, let's have a small recap about this battle you are shown here. You could see and you could clearly tell that I've done a lot of things right, and the enemy player has done, if not everything, he has done a lot of things wrong. You could see that in this battle I have managed to contain him in the left front. I have managed to even encircle him in this sector. For a while I've managed to use a lot of artillery strikes coordinated with my push moves, and I've used a lot of air bombing raids with my aircraft to annihilate and destroy a lot of units he had in this sector, and even units that were trying to reach this sector. I managed to destroy them en route. You could see that I've managed to eventually push with my tanks all the way up to his aircraft systems, anti-aircraft units, like those 2 Rolands, and I've managed to destroy them. And even though I had the upper hand, and you could see that I had the upper hand, I managed to. He didn't even pull back the Roland. He kept them in place for them to be annihilated, which is another mistake he has made. And he kept pushing in infantry carriers without even unloading them, which is another mistake. And still, even though my units had the pickle on them, and those are very powerful 29 rounds per minute recon tanks, and still the enemy infantry carrier manages to wipe them out and obliterate them with ease with its better fire rate. And this is just frustrating to watch, because even if you're doing everything right, you're still susceptible to defeat in this game, particularly if you're facing off against a weaker opponent. It just comes to show that how deficient the Israeli deck really is. It takes you the entire amount of the battle timer to stabilize the front, to be able to be pushing back. And now you could see 8 minutes when there are 8 minutes left in the game. You could see that I've managed to started to push forward and maybe turn the tide. Which, if I was facing a very strong opponent, this would not happen, because he wouldn't make the mistakes this guy has made all along the entire battles. He's just he would have preserved his troops. He wouldn't have, rushed units into guns. Wouldn't fly helicopters over occupied areas for them to get obliterated before they unload their infantry units. All those things that this player has done wrong, and still he manages to stay in the game, which is pretty amazing. And again, just comes to show how deficient the Israeli deck really is. So for you to win a game, you need your enemy to be very, very low skilled. And you need luck combined with the poor skill of your opponent to be able to just barely make it. Quite simply, the enemy can allow himself to make mistakes, to rush forward without any consequences to that effect. He can lose units, and he can afford to make those mistakes, and even while he's making mistakes, he can make a lot of gains. I mean, even if he's pushing through areas without any cover or coordinated strikes with air power or artillery, even if he's rushing an ambush area, he gets away with it. And the funny thing is that he makes damage on your forces, a lot of damage. You suffer casualties, even if you're doing everything right. Casualties that you cannot afford to make. That if you were trying to play the same way that your enemy player, if you would exhibit the same amount of incompetence while facing your opponent, rushing units like that, you wouldn't survive. Your units, you can't afford to make any mistakes. You can't afford to make any mistakes, and you can't afford to have a higher rate of losses. And because the Israeli deck is, as I said, it's not cost effective. Every unit is very important to you. Every loss of each and every unit is monumental. So you can't afford to make mistakes, while the enemy can afford to make a lot of mistakes and to get away with it with some level of success. So we are talking here about something that it's not. I know that it's foolish. You shouldn't be saying that that sentence, that life ain't fair. Yeah, right, but this is a game. And I know that life ain't fair, but this game should have some sort of balance to it to allow each and every player, according to their ability, to be able to succeed. But it's like when you play the Israeli deck, the opportunity for you to succeed depending on your skill is deprived from you. And this is very frustrating, and I want Eugen Systems to correct it. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go over to the armory, and we're going to go over the deck of Israel, and I'm going to, try to talk about the deficiencies, and want to go into the Israeli deck and talk about what needs to be done to correct this imbalance. What I think Eugen should do to fix this problem. And I just want to note that if you check the map and you check the timer, you will see that against such an inexperienced player, and may I remind you guys that I was a Major General before the leaderboard reset. I'm a very experienced player, specifically playing the Israeli deck. So I'm not bragging here, but I know the dynamics of the game. I know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not bragging. It's not vanity. It's just me saying that I think I've learned this deck from top to bottom, and I think I know that there are really serious problems about this deck, and I want to give suggestions about what needs to be done to fix this imbalance. So one last thing, if you check the timer and you check the map, and you just get to see that even fighting against such an inexperienced player that leaves his units in the open and rushes units without unloading troops and flying helicopters over occupied areas and doing every single mistake there is to be made. And it took me the last few minutes to turn the tide and win this battle, which is it's insane because it's like you don't need a lot of skill to use any other deck to defeat the Israeli deck, and that thing is not called balance. If someone is highly skilled player facing off against a very poor skilled player, I think it should be shown quite clear in the battle. And I think that the poor skilled player should be forced to make improvements in his strategy and tactics and the way of playing the game. I don't think he should be rewarded for that, for playing poorly against a deck that is imbalanced. I think Eugen system should just balance it out, give more power to the Israeli deck, and bring it up to speed. That's it. And I'm going to talk about it now and give some suggestions, and that's it.